Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to our East Coast families. I'm excited to join you today on this Saturday to go through a presentation about College Admissions 101. So our ultimate goal of this presentation is to help you navigate the process and to help you maximize your success, right? There has been a lot of confusion in this past year around what to take, when to take it, etc., and families are confused. So again, our ultimate goal today is to help you kind of better understand the landscape of how COVID has impacted college admissions, also how COVID has impacted the requirements to even be able to apply to universities, and then kind of what does that mean for you if you have a junior, a sophomore, a freshman, etc. So again, our ultimate goal is to help arm you with information by really kind of doing an overview of what has happened so that you just kind of better understand what you should be doing on your steps forward. So we will go ahead and begin. I'm Dr. Jennifer Windward. I'm the founder and CEO of Windward Academy. Again, very happy to be with you today to take you through this presentation and hopefully give you the context and the information so that you just feel a little bit more comfortable with what's been happening and what you should do next. As I mentioned, our agenda for today is kind of number one, to take you through what has been the impact, like what have we seen so far in terms of how COVID has impacted college admissions and the college application process. Number two, we'll talk specifically about ACT, SAT, subject tests, AP exams. What do you need to take? Do you need to still take them, etc.? And then lastly, we'll finish off just talking about kind of what are the emerging trends for class of 22 and beyond. What should you be focusing on? Okay, so here we go. First thing I want to do is kind of take you through a timeline of the past year. So number one, for students in the class of 2020, right? So in March, when COVID hit, they would have been close to graduating. So they would have already taken their ACT or SAT exams. We had a quote unquote normal year in terms of testing with 4 million students taking the SAT and the ACT. Of course, we all know that March of 2020 is when COVID hit, and then that's when things obviously started to change. So pretty much all of the spring exams were canceled by ACT and College Board. Students weren't even able to take the test even if they wanted to. So how did the colleges respond? Well, by June, 95% of selective four-year colleges and universities became test optional. They had to, right? They can't require that a student take an exam to be able to be eligible for admission if it's just impossible for the student to take it. So we see these cancellations, and then of course the colleges responding to the needs of the students, saying, hey, maybe last year if you applied to UCLA, if you didn't have an ACT or SAT score, you wouldn't even be eligible for admission. Now they're saying, yes, you can apply even if you don't have a score. So that's what test optional means, right? It means that you can provide a score if you want to, and if you have one. If you don't want to, and if you don't have a score, it's not a requirement to be admitted. So then what happened in the fall? We saw a big divide in the fall of kind of states that tended to be more open versus states that tended to be more restrictive, and that was directly correlated to where students were able to take exams. I live in San Diego. Windward Academy is headquartered in San Diego. And what we saw basically in the fall is that SAT exams were canceled, but ACT exams still happened. So ACT was very clever and noticed that when schools were going to be closed, they actually reached out to hotels. So hotels were the sites, like they used the huge ballrooms where they could space students out a lot. They all wore masks when they were taking their exams. And so in the fall, ACT actually had 7 exams just in September and October. They added tons of administrations, and those were able to happen, again, kind of even in more restrictive areas. By the December exam, however, both the ACT and SAT were canceled in San Diego because we were under a statewide stay-at-home order. So when it comes to kind of deciding and understanding what does that mean, right? That means that students now applying to college, really only half of students who were registered and wanted to take the test will have a score. So how did that impact early action and early decision applications, right? So when you apply to college, there are November deadlines that are either early action or early decision. Basically, it gives you an early opportunity to apply to a college where you actually get to hear back by December if you've been admitted. Early action is a program that's more flexible. So you can usually apply to multiple schools early action. If you get in, you're under no obligation to actually attend. Whereas with early decision is binding. That means that when you apply to a school early decision, if they let you in, you are expected to attend, right? You have to sign a letter that says, yes, I will go if I get in. A parent or legal guardian has to sign the same thing, and your college counselor from your high school. Basically, the colleges want to know if we let you in, you're coming. So that's kind of the difference between early action and early decision. I realize that was kind of a cursory overview, but it's important to know that we have data now from what happened with the early action and early decision applications, because of course they were just this past November and students heard in December. So a lot of colleges have started to release their data. So I'm going to share some of that data with you this morning. Overall, what we saw, and I realize telling you all this is only going to make this more stressful. But what we saw from the early action and early decision applications is that college applications have drastically increased. So way more people are applying, which means that admission rates are going down, right? It's becoming harder to get accepted. And I will show you some data on that here in a second. And that brings us, of course, to what's next, right? What does that mean for current juniors, for current sophomores, for current freshmen? And that's, again, what we're really going to go over today. So here's a quick summary for you, kind of what happened for class of 2020, which remember, again, they would have taken their exams prior to COVID. What happened to class of 2021? Those were students who were juniors when COVID hit. So these were all the students planning to take the exams in spring of junior year, summer leading into senior year, or even early senior year. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but kind of the main takeaway message, of course, is that the number of colleges who required ACT and SAT, of course, drastically decreased, right? Where the ACT or SAT being required, we saw a huge decline. Now, in terms of class of 2022, right, that's what we really need to focus on because you're the ones who are trying to figure out what you should be doing, right? You're the current juniors. So it's really just been in the past week or so that we've seen colleges starting to announce whether they're going to stay test optional or whether they're going to go back to requiring the ACT and SAT. So let me show you. So USC and Stanford, right, two very popular schools that students apply to. Here's what they're currently communicating in terms of their class of 22 testing policy, right? So you'll notice that USC basically announced, hey, because of COVID, we're going to suspend our standardized testing requirement for 1 year, right? So that would then not apply to students in the class of 2022. That would have only applied to students kind of about to graduate now who would have applied in December or January. Then it says, this policy will not continue unless the USC Office of Admission makes an announcement. So this is why it's confusing for families, right? Because you try to figure out what you should do. Should you be preparing for these tests? Should you be taking them? And a lot of colleges still haven't yet announced what their policies are going to be for next year. Same thing with Stanford. Stanford had, this statement. We understand the difficulty, right, that students are facing trying to prepare for these exams and trying to access them. As a result, for this year only, right? So they made that 1 year determination of being test optional with a plan to return to requiring the ACT and SAT. But it was, of course, optional, right? Stanford will review applications with or without test scores. So the decision is up to the applicant. Do you want Stanford to see your scores when you apply, or do you not want them to see them? Now, here's a list of some colleges who have announced prior to today's presentation that they are going to stay test optional again for this coming class. So for current juniors, it's still a test optional situation. Harvard actually announced this last week. Usually what we see is kind of when Harvard makes announcements, they tend to kind of trickle into other universities who follow suit. It's very possible that after Harvard's announcement that it will stay test optional, that we'll see more colleges start to announce that they're going to do the same. But again, this information is ongoing. It changes every single day. So I wanted to just give you a snapshot of kind of where it stands now, what colleges have said that for current juniors, it's going to remain test optional. Now, we of course need to talk for a second about the UC schools, the University of California schools, because they are confusing everybody. So let me kind of give you a summary of this. So in 2020, the UCs announced kind of this 5-year plan. For the first 2 years, they wanted to be test optional. Then they were going to have 2 years of being test blind. Test blind means even if you give them a score, they're not allowed to consider it, or they're not allowed to look at it when they're making a decision on your acceptance. So they were going to have 2 years test optional, 2 years test blind. And then the UC's kind of 5-year plan was that by the 5th year, they were going to have their own test for admissions. So the UC schools, right, which have more applications than any other kind of college or university system, they want to have their own test. And if you actually read the report from the Academic Senate, the UC regents, basically they think the ACT and SAT is too easy. And so they want to create their own test that they think will help them better gauge whether students are ready for their curriculum and ready for their rigor. Now, I've worked in the UC system for a long time, and to be honest, to think that during COVID that they're going to hit this mark of in 5 years, they're going to be a testing agency like ACT and SAT, they're going to have tests, they're going to be able to administer them around the world. I don't think it's going to happen, to be completely honest, but who knows, maybe they'll surprise us, and maybe during COVID, they've all just been inside working on this test nonstop. But again, this was kind of the plan that the UCs had. Then you add in a lawsuit. And how did a lawsuit impact this? So again, the UC schools wanted to be test optional for 2 years. Then there was a student in California who had a learning disability who was trying to take the SAT and couldn't get the accommodations that were promised to her because of her disability. So she sued, basically saying that I'm trying to have a score. I'm trying to put my best foot forward to still have a score even when you're test optional. Because of COVID, I can't take it with the right conditions given my disability. So a judge basically had this ruling saying, okay, UC system, I don't care that you want to be test optional. You have to be test blind. You cannot consider test scores when you admit students because they haven't been able to be administered fairly for students with disabilities. So it was kind of this whirlwind for the UCs that they wanted to be test optional, but were kind of forced to be test blind for last year. So as of right now, and again, this is always subject to change, we're kind of back with the UCs being test optional for this year, unless something changes, unless we see another lawsuit, unless we see that, you know, if all of the tests this coming spring are canceled, if the tests over the summer, if the tests next fall, if we continue to see cancellations, who knows what's going to happen, right? But again, the UCs have caused a lot of confusion. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to really clearly explain kind of what the policy is and what students should be doing there. Now this slide, I'm going to warn you all in advance, is probably going to stress you out a little bit. But again, I want you to have the information. So what I'm showing you are 5 Ivy League colleges. So we have Brown, Dartmouth, Harvard, Penn, and Yale. These lighter kind of shades show how many students applied between 2020 and then 2021. The darker colors show you how many students were accepted. These numbers at the top show the increase in the amount of applications that they received. Obviously, the most staggering one here is Harvard, which saw an increase of 57% in terms of the number of students who applied to Harvard early. Then what's the scary part? Well, if we look at how many students were accepted, we actually saw that that number went down. Now, to be honest, I don't think Harvard wanted to do this. I don't think that they wanted to accept fewer students, but I don't think that they had a choice, because remember what happened is they had a plan for their incoming class, and they had hundreds of students who deferred, who wanted to take a gap year, who basically said, I don't want to start college at Harvard when I have to do it from home from my couch. I'm going to wait and I'm going to start next year. So Harvard held those spaces for students. They didn't come, of course. So the current class that started at Harvard this past fall is smaller, But now Harvard is restrained, right? They can't accept more students because they had to hold those spots for the students who deferred and took a gap year and want to start this coming fall instead of last fall. So overall, what we have seen from these early action and early decision applications is that more students are applying, especially to the more competitive schools, and the colleges are either accepting the same number of students or fewer students because they just don't have the space, right? It's not like for the past year during COVID, they've been building dorms and hiring professors and having new classrooms, right? They're still constrained physically with their campus. And so they're not in a position that even though they have this huge increase in the students applying, that doesn't mean they can accept a lot more students. So again, this is, honestly, I've been doing this for over 20 years, helping students with ACT, SAT, APs, applying to college, etc. I have never seen a more stressful landscape when it comes to, and this was already stressful. And so anyway, I do want to share this information with you because I want you to know it. But I also recognize that hearing some of this is not going to help you feel better. It's going to help you feel like, or it's not going to help you, excuse me, it's going to just make you feel a little bit more overwhelmed about this process. Wow, we see this drastic increase, the number of students applying, it's just getting more and more competitive. Now, I am going to share some tips with you of what you can be doing so that even in this more competitive landscape, you can still help yourself stand out. Now, the next question that people ask me all the time, because there are all of these reports now about how average ACT and SAT scores of admitted students, that average is increasing. And parents are going crazy. They're like, oh my gosh, how is it harder? How do I even get a higher ACT or SAT score, right, for the students who are applying and submitting scores? So I have this box plot. We're going to do a little math for a second because I want to help you understand how that's possible that the average has been increasing. So this is kind of Harvard's scale in terms of, the 25% of students who were admitted had between a 1570 and a 1600 on the SAT. 50% of students had between a 1460 and a 1570. And then 25% of students had below a 1460. I set the bottom as 1200 because the vast majority of students are between a 1200 and a 1460. But we do see some students getting accepted to Harvard who have like 1000 or 1100 on the SAT. So this was kind of the scale, right, that we saw prior to COVID. So the question becomes, how could this box capturing the middle 50%, how could it even shift at all higher, right? How is that possible? Well, the reason is that students who were performing on kind of the, underneath this middle 50% range are the ones who applied without reporting their scores. So what happened is we naturally see the average increase because if 25% of students who used to have scores that were on the lower end no longer report their scores, then of course we're going to see the average increase. So when you see that the averages are increasing, I don't want you to panic and think, oh my gosh, now I'm under even more pressure to score even higher. I want you to remember that prior to this, right, Harvard was open to accepting a quarter of its students who were, more like 1200 to 1400 range. So if you're in that range, it's okay to submit your scores. Like Harvard was open to accepting students who had scores in that range. So if you're feeling squeezed, if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm under even more pressure, how do I even hit this, this mark where it's higher? Remember that the only reason it's higher is an artificial higher. It's a higher because fewer people are reporting their scores, and the only ones reporting scores are in that higher range. So if you take the ACT or if you take the SAT, and if you're on the SAT, you get a 1450, you shouldn't look at this and think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to submit my scores, right? That's still an exceptional score. That's still putting you with other students who have been accepted. I mean, if you took the SAT and you got a 900, I'd probably take advantage of the test optional policy and not report the score, right? But if you're getting a solid score that shows that you are bright and that you work hard and that you can be competitive in their academic environment, it's definitely something to showcase that can help your application. Now, here's some more data, kind of if we look at the early action class of 2021. So what do we know about the students who have been accepted to Harvard from this early pool? So what I'm showing you here are kind of increases or decreases in the demographics of the students. So what we notice is that if you look at the students accepted to Harvard for early action, we see big increases from 10% to 17% of the number of students who are going to be the first in their families to go to college. We also see big increases in the number of students who will be eligible for government money for college and also for Harvard's financial aid initiative. That's what HFAI means. It basically means financial aid coming from the university. So big increases in the amount of students who are going to be first gen and who are going to, rely on Harvard for financial assistance to apply. We also saw a big increase in the percentage of African-American students who were accepted to Harvard, right? Basically from 12.7% to 16.6%. And then we saw decreases in the amount of students who were Asian, Latinx, and white. And then Native American and Native Hawaiian students, we didn't see a change in their kind of incoming class of the students that they've accepted. So this just gives you kind of a sneak peek or a window into kind of what does the class look like who has been accepted at Harvard. Now, I also want to talk about UCLA because it is the most applied to university in the country, or actually in the world. It used to be the most applications with 109,000. This year, right, because all of these applications to the UCs were due in November. So we have data right now about who applied. We don't have data yet about who was accepted. So I'm going to have to do another one of these presentations in April after we get some of those data to help you see kind of some of those shifts in who was accepted. But you see a huge increase in the amount of students who have applied to UCLA. So an increase of 28% going from 109,000 to 139,000 applications, like 140,000 applications. Last year, UCLA admitted 14% of students. With this jump of 28% more applications, if UCLA accepts the same number of students, we're going to see a drop to an 11% acceptance rate. And kind of similar to what we saw with Harvard, right? We have increases in the amount of African-American students who applied. Clearly with Harvard, we know who got in and we know that more of them were accepted. But we do see increases in the Latinx applications to UCLA and also for transfer students. So UCLA pretty much always sets the record for the most applications. It had already done that in the fall of 2020, and it continued to do that in the fall of 2021. So why would colleges be test optional, right? Obviously, they kind of have to be if students can't take the ACT or SAT, but what are some of the other kind of reasons behind why colleges might stay test optional? Number one, we see an increase in the diversity of accepted students when they're test optional, which a lot of colleges are prioritizing. As I've shared with you, we see an increase in the number of people who apply. Why would colleges want that? Well, number one, it makes them look more competitive, right? Their acceptance rate is going to go down. Number two, they make a lot more money, right? When you see increases in applications, those applications are anywhere from like $60 to $100 just to apply to the college. So we're talking about colleges being able to make $10 million just from their applications, right? So when you have more people applying and you have more people paying to apply, clearly this is also a revenue stream for the universities. What's another reason being test optional benefits colleges? Well, as I kind of broke down for you, they get to report higher average SAT and ACT scores because the students who have those higher scores are the ones who are typically submitting them. They also are hoping for a little boost in their school's ranking in the US News and World Report because being test optional is part of the formula that kind of helps to rank colleges. Okay, so that was kind of an overview of how have we seen college applications and college admissions kind of shift based on the data that we have now. What about testing, right? Do I take ACT? Do I take SAT? What has kind of changed there? So prior to COVID, right, students would have to take an ACT or an SAT. These are the 4-hour tests that have, not stuff from school, right? You don't have to know history, you don't have to know physics, you don't have to know bio. You have to know grammar rules, You have to know math equations, basically from algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and a little trig. And then you have to know how to be a strong reader, right? That's what the ACT and SAT tested you on. And then they both have these optional essays. Then there were these other tests that were called SAT subject tests. These were only 1 hour each. You could take up to 3 in a single setting, or in a single sitting, excuse me. And these were the actual tests on subjects, right? Like you would take one on US history, you would take one on physics, you would take one on Spanish, you would take one on Chinese, right? So these were tests that were actually related to specific content from school. Like it's almost like a final exam for the test you took all year. So College Board kind of shook things up about 2 weeks ago when it announced that it is no longer going to offer the optional essay on the SAT. A reason, if you ask me, why College Board is doing this is that it's expensive for them because they have to pay a bunch of humans, right, a bunch of people to read essays that students write and to score them. So this is definitely going to save College Board some money that it's no longer offering these optional essays. The other thing that College Board did is it got rid of subject tests. Now, in the US colleges, why were subject tests even still around? We still saw some colleges that were really competitive, kind of having a highly recommended approach for students that they submitted 2 or 3 subject tests. We had some programs like an engineering program or a pre-med program that were still requiring SAT subject tests. So they wanted a student to submit a math and a science so that they could really gauge kind of how they perform on these subject-specific exams. Subject tests were also used to kind of help determine if students could pass out of certain classes, right? So helping kind of decide where they should start when they matriculate at the university. International schools, like if we look at schools in the UK, they really heavily weighed SAT subject tests. So this is going to kind of disrupt the college admissions process more for some of those international universities than it will for our universities in the United States. But if you have these really competitive engineering programs that used to really like getting subject tests for math and science, they're not even going to be able to get those anymore because College Board isn't even going to offer these anymore. So one thing that I will say is that the subject tests were hard. Like students would really have to review all of the content that they studied throughout the year. It was usually nice for students because they could take the subject test around the same time as they take their AP courses. So they're kind of in that mindset of trying to remember all of that content squeezed together in time. But they're not going to be offered anymore. So chances are these engineering programs, they're going to have to find some other way that they want to gauge, students' readiness in math and science. So what that means currently, right, is that College Board basically got rid of the subject test and wants to be 100% focused on the SAT. So now the tests that are offered where students have to make a decision, even in this test optional climate, they're really choosing between ACT and SAT. They no longer have to worry about the subject tests. Now, I can give a 2-hour presentation on the differences between the ACT and SAT, what's tested, how frequently, how to study for them. I'm not going to do that today because this is more about a big picture overview, but I can follow up and send you all kind of links to more of those resources if that would be helpful. But just a quick overview of kind of ACT versus SAT. They're pretty much about the same length, 2 hours and 55 minutes versus 3 hours without the writing component. They test the same content. So what a lot of families get confused about is kind of what do I need to study for ACT and SAT? The content is virtually identical between these exams. You have to know grammar rules. You have to remember your math equations from several years of instruction, even going back to stuff you learned in middle school. They're really trying to assess how much you remember across these multiple courses. And then they're also testing you on your reading skills. Can you, read a passage and answer questions that are, discussed in the passage or answered or addressed in the passage? So again, the content is the same, but the structure of the test is a little bit different. They have different scoring conversions, which always confuses people. So we actually have concordance tables that we provide that show you how to convert between an ACT and SAT score. And they're both offered 7 times per year. They do kind of rotate months a little bit, right? So students right now, literally right now, students are taking the ACT But March is offered in, or excuse me, the SAT is offered in March, ACT is in April, SAT is in May. They're both offered in June, ACT in July, SAT in August. Like, so they kind of rotate, and then there's some months when both tests are offered. Now, because I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about ACT, SAT, I'm just going to go through kind of the most frequently asked questions that I get from parents when I'm talking to them about, their teens' ACT or SAT preparation. So first question I get a lot is one test or the other preferred by colleges, right? How should students pick? So there is not one test that's preferred over the other. Colleges accept both equally. So the best way for students to pick is for them to pick the test on which they will perform better. How do they know what that is? They should take a diagnostic ACT, which must be a past real exam. Don't take a practice test that's made up by a prep company, because there are a lot of unscrupulous practices where they will make that diagnostic artificially harder than a real exam so that your score looks lower. If you take a practice test, you better make sure it is a real past exam. This is so critical. Trust me, it took us 4 months working with ACT and a year and a half working with College Board to get legal permission to provide real past exams to our students. We went through that process because it is that critical. It is that important. You deserve to have an accurate sense of how you're going to score. The only way you're going to do that is if you have access to a real past exam. So you should take a practice ACT, you should take a practice SAT, again, making sure they're real past exams, and then you can compare your scores between the two. That's really the best way to determine which test to take. It was in 2012 that the ACT kind of first overtook the SAT in terms of being the more popular exam. And then kind of since then, they've just been kind of going in parallel with each other. But neither is preferred by colleges. So really, it's all about you. Which test are you going to perform higher on? How are they different? Which one is harder? Again, I can talk for hours about this, but just very quickly, the way they're the same is with the content they test. So whether you're taking the ACT or SAT, you still have to remember grammar rules, you still have to remember math equations, and you still have to be a strong reader. One place in which students struggle a little bit is that in the SAT has a non-calculator math section, whereas the ACT, every single math question, you're allowed to use a calculator. So some students do struggle a bit doing math without a calculator. So for them, the SAT can be particularly challenging. Another difference is kind of how they structure their questions. So the ACT tends to be much more straightforward with the questions that it asks, but then you have a little bit less time to do it. So for example, if the ACT asked you to find the area of a trapezoid, they would give you the shape, they would show you the bases, they would tell you what the height is, and then they're just basically seeing, do you know the formula to solve this? The SAT might have kind of a longer word problem. They might give you extra information that you don't really need to know to be able to solve the math question. So it's a little bit harder because you have to kind of extract what you need and then solve, but they do give you more time, right? So on the SAT, students get on average 10 more seconds per question. Doesn't sound like a lot, but honestly, 10 seconds can make a difference as you're working through. But the trade-off is that if the question is a little bit harder, are you really going to feel like you have more time? So what students really need to do is take both, get that experience, and then compare their scores, because there are some of these subtle differences, even though the content that they test is the same. Another question I get a lot, how many practice exams do students typically take before they do the real one? Basically, the progression is students take a diagnostic, use that information to identify their content area gaps. If I make a lot of mistakes on commas, that means I need to go study commas. If I forget the difference between circumference and area of a circle, I need to go review those formulas and review those questions, right? So they kind of take this initial practice to identify what they need to review to fill in those content area gaps. Then they kind of start to take more practice tests and review their mistakes as they build up for the real one. So I'd say most students will take usually about 3 or 4 kind of full-timed practice tests before the real one. But you also see some students who are really, really pushing, and they might even take 8 practice tests before the real one, right? So there's a big range, but what I will say is that quality is much more important than quantity when it comes to doing practice tests. It is way more important that you put in the time to review every mistake that you miss and to learn from every single mistake, right? That process is way more important than just rushing and taking another practice test, right? You should not, if you took practice test 1, you shouldn't take practice test 2 until you are 100% confident with every single question you missed on practice test 1. When you have achieved that level of confidence, when you've achieved that level of understanding of the content, okay, now you're ready to take another practice test. How should students review after doing a practice? So I kind of just hinted at this a little bit, but the worst thing they should do is ignore the test, right? The first thing that's most important is after you take this time practice, you dig into your mistakes, every single one, every single question. Do you understand what it was asking? Do you understand how to solve it correctly? And most importantly, do you understand why you missed it? That third step, right, that encourages that metacognitive process, really thinking about why you missed a question, that is the most important part. Every single time I work with students, even in our platform, we built this out to kind of force students to do this process. They are put in a situation in which for anything they miss, they are, tasked with writing themselves a hint, writing down why did they miss this question, because that is where you see the huge growth in student scores. And by the way, that's just a great practice with any type of academic experience or with any type of work experience or with any type of personal experience, right? It's all about learning from your mistakes, recognizing where they came from, and then using that information to inform future decisions. What is the biggest mistake students make when they prepare? The absolute biggest mistake students make is that they go into this test. They think I'm going to do better if I take 20 practice tests every single Saturday. That is completely false. As I already mentioned, it's about quality over quantity. The biggest mistake students make is that test mentality. What they really need to do is pause after each practice test, review their mistakes, learn from their mistakes, teach other people what they missed and why. Teach a sibling, tell a parent, tell a teacher, hey, I learned this on my exam. Did you know the difference between who and whom? Well, I do, right? And then kind of be engaged in conversations, recognizing that you're learning and you're filling these content gaps and building skills that are really critical into your life. Parents ask me sometimes if there was one thing I would recommend to boost a score, what would it be? Like one thing that a student could do starting in middle school or starting in early high school. The answer is read. I promise you, because again, I've been doing this for so long, the students I see who are juniors, who are taking these exams, who are not that stressed, who can kind of take a test very easily and without a lot of kind of pressure, they are strong readers, right? That is what they have in common. They remember what they read, they remember where they read it. So when they see a question that asks, what sport did Jennifer play last weekend? They go, oh yeah, that was over here in this paragraph. Oh, what sport did she play? Oh, she played tennis. Okay, the answer is tennis, right? But if you see that question and you don't remember where it talked about Jennifer playing sports last weekend, you're going to now go through this passage, like trying to find where that happened. So again, if there is something that you can do to just build your students' confidence, not only on this test, but also just kind of to make school easier in general, it's reading, right? Reading is a critical skill. So if I had to pick one thing, again, I would pick many, but if I had to pick one thing that you could do in middle school, that you could do in early high school, that would really kind of help you with these exams, it's reading. What about a super score? What's a super score, and is that only for the SAT? So let me first kind of break down what a super score is. So super score is the idea that if you take the test multiple times, so let's say I take the ACT today, which I have lots of students taking the test today. So this is good. I'm doing this presentation because it distracts me because I'm nervous for them. So let's say I have students who take the test today and get their scores back in about 2 weeks. And then I have a student who's like, oh my gosh, Dr. Winward, I crushed the English, I crushed the math, I crushed the reading, but I'm kind of worried about my science. I think I could do a little bit better in my science. The idea of a super score is that if this student takes the exam again in April and has a higher score in the science than he or she did in the test he or she's taking right now, then you can create this new composite or a super score that would take your English, math, and reading from one test, your science from another, and kind of create a new score. Super scoring is not something that's only done for the SAT. That's a very common misconception. You can super score ACT scores as well. And that actually leads me to my next point about ACT section retakes. So this is something that was originally scheduled for September of 2020, which is clearly long gone and did not happen. And what ACT was planning to do last September, prior to COVID disrupting everything, was allow students to do retakes just of one section or just two sections. So if we go back to that example I just gave with, my pretend student taking the test today, if that student loved English, math, and reading and only really was worried about pulling up a science score, instead of having to retake the entire test to get a new science score, ACT was going to allow students to show up and just take science and leave. Like they could literally cherry pick, I want to just redo English, math, or I want to only redo reading, or I want to only redo science. Students were going to be able to just retake a single section. And then if they did better on that retake, they were going to calculate a new super score, a new composite for the student. This was amazing. When this announcement was made about a year and a half ago, this was going to be the biggest change that we had seen in standardized tests to really benefit students, to really give them an opportunity to show what they're capable of, right? Because the test is long, and staying focused for 4 hours with only one 10-minute break, right? A lot of students get tired towards the end, whereas if they could show up and take science first and then leave, they could do better because they're just more alert, right? Versus taking it after the other sections when the student's more tired. So this question about when are the retakes actually going to start, I wish I knew the answer to. I am keeping on top of all of this with ACT and its announcements. I'm crossing my fingers, maybe April, but not likely because we're in the February test right now and we haven't heard anything, but hopefully it starts to happen by June. Pretty much what happened is all of these things that ACT was going to change to make things much more student friendly have just all been put on hold because they're just trying to get students to take the actual test that they've already been offering, right? Versus introducing something new, like, showing up, who's taking what, and organizing that is going to be a lot more confusing. So hopefully once things, quote unquote, normalize or just get back to, how it was before with students being able to access and take these exams, hopefully we'll then see an announcement about these retakes and when they're going to be available. Quick time check. I know I've been talking for a while here, but I think I have about 5 or so minutes left, and then we'll go to your questions that you've either put in the Q&A or the chat. I want to quickly talk about AP exams because this was super confusing last year for families because all the AP exams were canceled. Students took them online. It was this shortened 45-minute version of an AP test that's typically 3 hours. So what is happening with the AP exams? So AP exams are always the first 2 weeks of May, right? And I'm actually on the next slide going to show you exactly what tests are scheduled and for when. What the AP, College Board, that's the company that puts out the AP exams, but what they're planning to do is to offer these extra contingency dates. So if you are a student who needs more time before you feel ready to take it because maybe the school year hasn't moved as quickly, you haven't yet been exposed to all the material, they're going to have extra dates when you can take the AP the second half of May, or they're going to have extra dates when you can take it the first 2 weeks of June. So AP exams are literally going to be offered for 6 weeks straight, right? It used to just be kind of those first 2 weeks and then they had some kind of makeup dates, but this is like full on offering them through school. Now, what happens if school is closed, right? Because AP exams, they're planning to offer them in their full length format with the full scope of content, right? So there's an expectation that if they're testing you on 12 chapters, you finished all 12 before the AP, right? If your school has only gotten through chapter 8, you have information that you haven't even learned that's going to be on the test, right? Which would be completely unfair to you if you weren't able to cover the content in class and then it was on this exam. So one thing is that each of your high schools has an AP coordinator. Okay, this AP coordinator is the person who gets to authorize whether students get to take the test from home or whether students are going to take the test at school. So AP, right, or College Board, they're offering all of these options: first 2 weeks of May, second 2 weeks of May, first 2 weeks of June. And really the decision is going to come from your school. So principals and assistant principals have been meeting like crazy this week because College Board just made this announcement like 2 days ago with these extra dates that they're offering. So schools are kind of trying to figure out right now what they're going to do. So I would expect that you should hear hopefully pretty soon from your high schools kind of what their plan is for AP exams. Now, just to kind of show you, I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm not going to break it all down, but of course I'm happy to share this presentation with you all. I'm happy to share a link to kind of a website that shows every single test and when it's going to be offered. But you'll notice, right, that the first week, that kind of first week of May, there are these morning slots and these afternoon slots as students are taking the AP exams. And then what you'll notice I did here for week 2 is that this again was just announced like 2 days ago. Instead of offering these tests on Thursday, May 13th, they moved them to Monday, May 17th. I cannot explain why they did this, but they did. So I kind of left it here to show, nope, it's not happening on Thursday anymore. It's now scheduled for the following Monday. And the reason I wanted to do that was just because students, if they maybe already looked at this and were expecting that their test was on that Thursday, I want to make sure that they know that it has been moved. Okay, so last thing, what does this all mean, right? What is the takeaway message for what I should be doing? So number one, just as we saw with UCLA, I would expect the UC system to, all of the UC system to show this uptick in applications, to show these increases. What does that mean? The acceptance rate is just going to keep going down. Very important to recognize that this shift to test optional does not mean that students aren't taking the ACT and SAT. It doesn't mean that they won't take them. Why would they still take them? Well, a lot of students pursuing scholarships are still taking the exams because it can help them secure more financial support. A lot of college coaches are still asking, right, within the athletics world, what's your GPA? What's your ACT or SAT score? So a lot of athletic programs are still liking to see these scores. And then just in general, at more competitive schools, students, want to show everything possible, want to distinguish themselves in any way they can. So a lot of students are still taking the exams. Keep in mind that for the UC schools, even though you don't have to have a score to apply, they are still using ACT and SAT scores when determining kind of where to place students for their classes. So if you score a certain level, you can actually pass out of certain requirements for like introductory English or introductory math classes. So it can actually kind of save you some time and money with your coursework. They're also using ACT and SAT scores to determine statewide eligibility, right? So the UC schools as a public system have an obligation to accept certain students who are performing at certain levels into their UCs. So even sometimes like you don't even apply to a UC school and you still get a letter of acceptance and you're like, how is this possible? I didn't even apply here. It's because of the kind of state eligibility rules and wanting to make sure that a certain percentage of students are accepted to their public institutions. In terms of average ACT, SAT scores, expect that they're going to be the same or even higher, right? So as colleges continue to be test optional, we absolutely see this trend that the students who are reporting their scores are the ones who have higher scores. Also recognize that this trend of kind of this shift to a more holistic review, what does that mean for students, right? And I could give an entire other presentation about, what should you be doing for your college applications? But quickly or briefly, they're going to give more weight to your experiences, to your recommendations, demonstrated interest. Right? They want to know if you're applying to my university, do you really want to come here, right? How can you demonstrate that interest really specifically to show that you're a great fit, that they have programs that they offer that you're going to take advantage of, that they're located in a community in which you want to do outreach or impact projects, right? How can you show that you want to go to a university and be as specific as possible, right? Colleges are really going to respond well to that because it's going to show that you put in the time to learn about them, to figure out how you would contribute to their mission and their vision, and how are you going to take advantage of the opportunities they offer, right? They're really, really, really going to want to see that, because college has always cared about that. Now they're going to care about it more. And then last thing, right? They really want to see that you are a person of character. Character is this huge movement. There's this whole movement actually that started at Harvard. It's called Kindness is Common Project, right? They're trying to promote kindness, and just the idea that when you are a person of good character, they want you on their campus. So when you're thinking about how to really showcase yourself, you're going to have your academics. You might take the ACT or SAT if you really think it can kind of give you a boost. And then you're going to be pursuing experiences and leadership and opportunities, again, to develop your character, to develop your morals, to figure out who you are and what's your identity and what do you care about, right? They're really, really, really going to want to see that you're doing that. So final slide. I know there was a lot to go over this morning. Taking the ACT or SAT in this test optional era is only something that can help you, right? It will not hurt you. It will help you because if you take it and you do really well, it's absolutely something that you should showcase. If you take it and you're like, nah, maybe I want to, if you take it and you decide maybe I'm not going to apply with these scores, it's not going to hurt you, right? So it's definitely something to think about if you're kind of looking for ways to make your application as competitive as possible. Why should you take the test or not, right? So deciding whether to take the ACT or SAT should be based on your goals and also based on your target college's average academic profile, right? So if a family called me and said, you know what, I think my son is just going to apply to CSUs this year. So California State Universities, right? So applying to San Diego State or Long Beach State. That student doesn't need to prioritize taking these exams, right? But if you have a student who's applying to more competitive schools, who really, really wants to study and wants to do well and thinks that that will help showcase his or her, academic prowess or capabilities, then it's something that you should prioritize. But again, thinking about timing and all of those things is a very personal decision. So that's where you're going to want to make sure you talk to someone who can help support you in kind of deciding when to take it and how to best prepare. Also, focusing on developing your character, your sense of self, your identity, your values, right? All of that should be a very high priority right now. It is a very stressful time. I recognize that this presentation this morning probably does not help with most of your stress level because I'm sharing data and information that people don't want to hear, right? No one wanted to hear that it was harder to get into top colleges, right? It was already hard enough. But that is unfortunately kind of the result of everything going on right now. So that is why I think it's really important that you really focus on yourself and who you are and the type of person you want to be, because when you can share that in a really genuine way in your applications, it really helps elevate, what you're talking about and the connection that the person will feel with your application. My last concluding thought is to read. As I mentioned before, reading is such a critical skill. I even see this in the students I've taught at university. Like when they are stronger readers, they can get through their chapters more quickly, they can study more quickly and more efficiently. It makes a huge difference, not just for ACT and SAT, but really just for your life when you're a stronger reader. So it's a skill that you can build, it's a skill you can develop. So, maybe take a break from the video games or from the Netflix binging and just pick up a book and read for an hour a day, if possible, or more, right? Really looking for opportunities and pick stuff that you just want to learn about, right? Read about something that you're really going to enjoy so that you get into it, right? Students, especially teens, start to not like reading because it becomes this forced thing that they have to do for school. So if you can find books about topics that they're going to be really engrossed in and really enjoy learning about, then hopefully we can continue to build that skill. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and look to the Q&A and the chat now to see what questions maybe came up. All right, let me see. What is driving the increase in the number of applications? So because colleges are test optional, a lot of students who would have never thought that they had a chance at certain universities are kind of just going for it. So the main thing driving increase in applications is that it's kind of easier to apply. The other thing that we've seen, because I also help students applying to med school, applying to, PhD programs and master's programs, they've seen the same crazy increases, like 30% increases, triple, so 300% increase in the amount of students applying to post-bac programs for pre-med. I mean, we have never seen anything like this, right? And so likely the increase of applications more to kind of graduate level or postgraduate opportunities is driven by the fact that students might be struggling to find jobs. They're kind of like, well, I guess I might as well stay in school and, so I'm doing something. But for undergrad, it definitely seems like it's been driven by, the fact that colleges are test optional. It's really made it easier for students to apply. Next question. I didn't catch if you said the retakes of certain sections was for the ACT only or for SAT as well. Thank you for asking me that. I did not clarify that. This is only an option for ACT. SAT has not made any announcements about ever offering section retakes. And actually the reason is that on the ACT, there are 4 sections and you get an individual score for each one. So it's very easy to just retake one and then recalculate an average. The SAT also has 4 sections, but there are only 2 scores. So like you have to take 2 sections to get 1 score and 2 sections to get another score. So it's harder for the SAT to give you the opportunity to just retake 1 section, because really if you want a new score, you'd have to retake 2 of the sections to be able to calculate a new score. So this opportunity to retake was only going to be offered by the ACT. To be honest, I think it drove a lot of families to the ACT because it was going to be so exciting that this was an opportunity. And again, now we're kind of on hold, waiting to see when that's an option. Next question. If test scores are optional, excuse me, let me get a little water. Excuse me. Okay. If test scores are optional, are schools weighing activities and essays more in the acceptance decision? Yeah, so I think maybe you asked that question before I got to that part of the presentation. So you are exactly right. Because test scores are optional, right? If they have them and a student does really well, that's great. That will only help you. But if you're not submitting a score, right, there's kind of an understanding, okay, either the score wasn't high or the student wasn't able to access it or take it. So they have to look at other things more. The other huge challenge is that GPA right now doesn't have, like, you can't trust GPAs as much anymore, right? Because some schools are still really hard and really pushing students, and they're really working hard to get A's or to get B's. And there are a lot of schools right now where students are getting A's for basically doing nothing. And so it's hard because, this GPA kind of trade-off is tough because colleges used to use ACT and SAT kind of as a benchmark to compare to GPA, and now they don't always have that. So you're exactly right that they have to look for other things to weigh more. What are activities that the student is doing or how, trying to continue to do even in this COVID, world. The essays definitely are critical, right? So I kind of hinted at how important it is that in your essays that you're really opening up about what you care about and who you are, and maybe something you've struggled with and learned from, right? You have to show that maturity. You have to show that outlook on life to really showcase who you are. So even more than before, those essays being strong and compelling, so critical. Going to college in the UK, is an SAT or ACT preferred? No, they will take ACT and SAT equally, kind of same thing as in the States. The only difference was in the UK, they used to really like subject tests, which are not even going to be available anymore. Let's see. Is there still time for a class of 2021 high school senior to take the SAT next month and to get it to admissions offices? You would have to check with the admissions offices. So a lot of them did say to students, hey, we're going to be flexible. If you have to take the test later, we'll still accept it. But other schools will have already made their decisions by the time the March SAT scores come out, which will be late March, which is basically when they announce admissions decisions. The one place where taking the SAT in March as a senior could help you is if you're applying to colleges with rolling admission. So that means that they're still accepting applications now. But pretty much if you had to apply, already the March SAT is likely going to be too late. Is there any way of finding out your test score so you can work on the areas necessary instead of waiting for 2 months? Yes, absolutely. So the best thing to do, especially for that initial test, is that you take a practice test at home, right? Or at school. And at Windward Academy, we offer free practice tests all the time, right? Where we're doing them virtually, obviously, where we're kind of proctoring through the computer, but then students get to keep their real test. They get to review it. They get to learn from their mistakes. That is what's so important. Because I agree with you. If you take a real test, then you have to wait to get your score and you never see the test again. There's no value in that from a diagnostic perspective, right? You need to be able to take a test, score it that day, and start to review your mistakes the next day. That is what we have to create for you to really be able to maximize your opportunity to grow. So to answer that question, great question. Yes, you need to just make sure that you can keep the physical exam that you take and that you get to, also keep your answers so that you can continue to review and learn from your mistakes. Okay, how does early action influence how much money that you can receive? So a lot of times you don't hear about financial support until after you've been accepted. So that's actually why there's kind of both early action and early decision, because some students are in a situation they can't apply early decision. They can't apply if something is binding, because if they don't get the financial support they need, they can't even go there. So that's where early action is a great alternative, where then you can kind of put your hat in the ring at multiple schools, but there's no binding that you have to go, just in case you wouldn't be able to afford to go with the financial support that they offer. So in general, applying early versus applying regular won't have that huge impact on grant money. But what I do recommend you do if you're looking for more financial support for colleges is make sure that you look into those private scholarships. So there are corporations that have scholarships. There are foundations that have scholarships for students, and they tend to be kind of untapped, where a lot of students don't apply. Even sometimes scholarships end up with more money than they even have to give away. Like, they want more people to apply. So if you've applied early to colleges, the benefit is that then you have more time to work on scholarship applications, which is definitely something that you should do. Okay, next question. When a 10th grade student can start to take the SAT? That was a really good question. I forgot to put that on my FAQ list. So when are you ready to take the test? So the main driving factor for when you're ready to take the ACT or the SAT is your math class. So both tests, ACT and SAT, will go through content that's taught in kind of Algebra 2 with a little bit of trig. So if you're in the integrated math sequence, that's kind of through the first half of integrated math 3. If you're in the more traditional, algebra, geometry, Algebra 2, trig, that Algebra 2 trig class is going to expose you again to as hard as the math can get. So I have a lot of students who are in advanced math tracks who are planning to take the ACT and SAT at the end of their sophomore year and at the beginning of their junior year. So they've been studying, they've been reviewing, and they're kind of gearing up for that. I also have students who are in 11th grade taking Algebra 2, so they aren't in a position that they can, take the exam until they really finish that math class. So again, math is really the key deciding factor for when you're ready to take the test, because we want to make sure you've been exposed to everything. But then, of course, even though you've been exposed to it, doesn't necessarily mean you remember all of it. So you do have to make sure that, yes, you've been exposed to, as hard as the content can get, but you're also likely going to have to put in some time to review what you first learned in middle school, all those little rules about exponents and radicals and, et cetera, to make sure that you're ready for all the content. So that question that was asked, what should my 10th grader do? I'm more than happy if you kind of reach out after to schedule time to chat with you, because again, it's a very personal decision about whether you should take, when you should take the exam. But if you have a 10th grader who's in advanced math, it's a very different conversation, because there is an opportunity to take the test earlier. Does UCLA really read all 139,000 college applications? How do they select the applications that they really read? So this is actually a very interesting question. So when I was in my PhD program, my grad stats professor used to work for UC Regents, and he actually wrote the algorithm that determined how students were accepted to UC schools. So they would apply what are called beta weights, right? These kind of different fractional components to different categories. And then if you reached a certain threshold, then they would read your application. The UC schools, that was a long time ago that I was in my doctoral program, and that's how the UCs used to do it. They shifted maybe about 10 years ago to saying that they do a holistic review, like that they actually read all of the applications. But you bring up a really good point, right? Are they actually reading these? I actually heard some admissions people from UCLA speak and basically say that they spend about 45 seconds to a minute reading each application. That's a devastating thing to hear for a student who spends 3 months working on the UC application and the personal insight questions and kind of wanting to pull together something really exceptional. But you ask a great question, like, how is it even physically possible to read that many applications? So what I would say is that, yes, they're dealing with a huge volume. Yes, they don't have a lot of time to read it. So again, that's why there's a lot of burden on students. You know, as they're looking at your application, they're kind of checking boxes in their head, like, okay, good GPA. You know, they used to obviously check test scores. You know, looking at activities, okay, doing a great job with these activities. Okay, now I'm going to learn about the student. I'm going to read the personal insight questions and actually gain some insight into who the person is. So what I would say is, it puts even more weight on how important it is that kind of those initial checks that they're doing are strong, that you have great grades, that you have great activities, that you've been a leader in different settings, that you've grown in your responsibilities in different, you know, outlets in which you put in time. But then the question is, are your personal insight questions really strong and really compelling? Because you don't have a lot of time to make a great impression, which is why it is really important that those essays are compelling and authentic, and that the person's really going to connect with you as he or she is reading. If a student has a low GPA, our college is looking at their ACT or SAT score. What is more important? Now, colleges will say that they care more about GPA, specifically GPA in rigorous classes, right? That's kind of what they're saying they most look for. Now, for a lot of students who maybe didn't have as strong of a GPA because maybe they were busy after school with athletics or with responsibilities or a job, maybe they didn't have as much time to study, they used to love the ACT and SAT because it was a way to kind of show, hey, even though my GPA isn't as strong as it should be, these are the reasons why, but I want to showcase my test score because I did really well. So I want you to see, you know, that I'm, you know, would be able to start at your university really ready to crush it, right? That's kind of where students would use one to kind of either, you know, elevate the other or just to kind of reinforce the other. Because it wouldn't make a lot of sense if a student had a 1.9 GPA and a 35 on the ACT, right? Clearly something is going on, what's going on with the 1.9 GPA, but a student could kind of use that score to balance it out. So I would say that if you have a killer GPA and you're in lots of advanced classes, like if you have a 4.6 or 4.7 or, you know, really, really, really high GPA, okay, then, you know, do you need the ACT or SAT to counteract that? No, but could you use an ACT or SAT to kind of reinforce where you're performing? Yes. Next question, will we be having a live proctored ACT practice test before the April exam? So April 17th is the exam. I need to double check. I mean, I'm sure that's something that we could do. We just have to, you know, pick a Saturday to do it that doesn't conflict with real tests in March or something like that. But we could definitely look into that. And then, you know, we send out those mass emails that kind of notify people of webinars and practice tests and all of that. So we can definitely look to do that. And I would want to do that anyway, because we have so many students taking the April ACT that I'd love for them to have the opportunity as well. Okay, all right. It looks like I've answered all the questions. For those of you who are still with me, thank you. I know that we've gone over time, but you had so many great questions, which I really appreciate. As I mentioned, I will follow up with everybody who was registered for today, everyone who attended today. I'll send you some links to resources to kind of learn more about the AP exams, to learn more about where to register for ACT or SAT. And then if there's anything else, any other resources that would be helpful to provide, please do feel free to email me back and let me know. And then that's something I can follow up with and also provide to support you all. So thank you again for attending. Have a great rest of your Saturday. Have a really nice weekend. And hopefully we'll connect with all of you again soon. Take care.